Welcome to terrifying stories where darkness whispers and every shadow hides a chilling tale. Prepare yourself for spine-tingling horror that will keep you up all night. Ready to dive into the unknown? Let the terror begin. Camping trips always sound like a great idea in theory. A weekend in the wilderness, disconnected from the world, and surrounded by nature. It's supposed to be peaceful, right? That was my plan, at least. I'd been working long hours at my desk job and needed a break. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head. So, I packed up my gear, loaded the car, and drove 3 hours out to a remote campsite I'd read about online. It wasn't a popular spot, which was perfect for me. I didn't want crowds or noise. I just wanted quiet. The campsite was located deep within a forest reserve, surrounded by tall pines and rugged terrain. The air was crisp and clean, the kind of air that makes you feel like you're really living. The drive there was uneventful except for the last stretch of the road. It was a narrow dirt path with potholes and sharp turns. My car struggled at times, but I managed. When I finally arrived, I parked at the designated spot and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't just quiet. It was completely still. No distant hum of cars, no chatter, nothing. Just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees. I unloaded my gear and set up camp in a small clearing a short walk from the parking area. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire pit. I'd brought enough food and water to last the weekend, along with a few other essentials. Once everything was in place, I sat down to enjoy the serenity. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The first day went by without incident. I spent most of it exploring the nearby trails. The forest was dense, with towering trees that blocked out much of the sunlight. The trails were faint, almost as if they hadn't been used in years. I'd occasionally stop to take in the scenery or snap a photo. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was an odd feeling about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to close in around you, or how the undergrowth was so thick it felt like it was swallowing the trails. Whatever it was, I shrugged it off and kept going. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set. I started a fire and cooked myself a simple meal. Sitting by the fire, I felt a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I'd needed. I stayed up for a while, staring at the flames and listening to the forest. The sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air, a chorus of chirps, croaks, and rustles. It was comforting in a way, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out here. When I finally crawled into my tent, exhaustion hit me hard. I fell asleep almost instantly, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. I lay there listening. The forest was silent again. Not the normal kind of silent, but the kind that makes your skin crawl. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just an oppressive stillness. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over my own breathing. It was coming from somewhere in the forest, a soft, rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It was the sound of someone walking. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the flashlight beside me and switched it on, aiming it toward the tent's entrance. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything unusual. The footsteps stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, flashlight in hand, ears straining to catch any sound. But there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination or some harmless animal. I lay back down, though I didn't sleep much after that. Every rustle or creak made me jump. When morning finally came, I felt a wave of relief. The sunlight made everything feel normal again. as if the night before had been just a bad dream. I spent the second day trying to shake off the unease. I went for another hike, this time venturing farther into the forest. The trails became even fainter and the undergrowth thicker. I had to push through branches and climb over fallen logs. It was exhausting, but it kept my mind occupied. At one point, I came across an old, overgrown trail marker. It was weathered and barely legible, but it seemed to point toward a lookout point. Curious, I decided to follow it. The trail led me up a steep incline, the kind that makes your legs burn and your lungs ache. But when I reached the top, the view was worth it. I could see the forest stretching out for miles, a sea of green with no sign of civilization. It was breathtaking. I sat there for a while, catching my breath and taking it all in. For the first time since the previous night, I felt at peace. But then I noticed something. On the ground, near the edge of the lookout, were footprints. They weren't mine. They were too large, and they were fresh. The dirt was still disturbed, as if someone had been there recently. My stomach tightened. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The forest below was still and quiet. Too quiet. I decided to head back to camp. The hike down felt longer than the hike up. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it was hiding something. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I hurried to get a fire going, the flickering flames providing a small sense of security. I ate a quick meal and sat by the fire, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. After all, this was a public forest. Other people could be out here, right? Maybe another hiker had been exploring the area. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The footsteps in the night, the fresh prints at the lookout, it was too much of a coincidence. I decided to keep my flashlight and a knife within arm's reach that night, just in case. When I crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning. The glow from the flames seeped through the fabric, casting faint orange light inside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too tense to sleep. Hours passed. The fire outside crackled softly, and the forest seemed alive with its usual nocturnal symphony. For a while, I thought maybe I'd been worrying for nothing. But then, just like the night before, the forest went silent. My body tensed. I strained to listen, my ears searching for any sound. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I gripped the flashlight and knife tightly, waiting. The footsteps stopped. Then there was a sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. The fire was still burning, casting flickering light across the clearing. But I didn't see anything. The scraping sound had stopped, and the footsteps were gone. I sat there, half in and half out of the tent, my heart racing. Then I saw it. On the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight, something was there. A shape barely visible in the shadows. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My hands were shaking as I aimed the flashlight toward it. The beam cut through the darkness, but by the time it reached the spot, the shape was gone. The undergrowth rustled faintly, as if something had slipped away into the forest. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, knife in hand, my back to the tent. When morning came, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound a threat. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear into the car and started the engine, not bothering to check if everything was secured. I just wanted to leave. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was another person, someone who didn't want me there. Or maybe it was something else, something I'll never understand. All I know is that I'll never go back to that campsite, and I'll never camp alone again. It started as a spur-of-the-moment idea. I had been feeling burnt out from work and decided to escape to the mountains for a few days. Camping had always been my way of disconnecting, of resetting. No emails, no phone calls, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. I chose a remote spot I'd read about online, a small, secluded area near a lake, miles away from any established campsites. It sounded perfect. The drive out there took most of the day. Winding roads turned into dirt trails, and eventually even those ended. From there, it was a couple of miles hike with all my gear strapped to my back. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, but it felt good to be away from everything. By the time I reached the clearing by the lake, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The water was still, reflecting the oranges and purples of the sky. It was breathtaking. Setting up camp was routine for me. I pitched my tent a little way back from the water's edge, nestled between two large trees. After gathering some firewood, I got a small fire going and cooked a quick meal. The quiet was profound. The only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish jumping and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I'd needed. That first night, I slept deeply. The air was cool but not cold, and the ground beneath my tent was soft enough to be comfortable. I woke up early, feeling refreshed and ready to explore the area. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my day pack and started hiking along the lake's edge. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than a path, but it was easy enough to follow. The lake was surrounded by dense forest, the trees pressing close to the water in some places. I found a few good spots to sit and take it all in, snapping a couple of photos with my phone before tucking it away. This trip wasn't about documenting. It was about being present. The second night, things started to feel a little different. I'd gone to bed early, tired from the day's hike, but I kept waking up. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But there was something about the rhythm of the noises that felt off, almost deliberate. It wasn't constant, but every so often, I'd hear what sounded like a footstep, heavy enough to distinguish from the usual forest sounds. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Just outside my tent, maybe 5 feet away, was a boot print. It was clear, pressed into the damp earth. I hadn't seen anyone else since I'd arrived, and this was far off the beaten path. It didn't make sense. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was old, left by someone who'd camped here before me. But the edges were sharp, the print fresh. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I stuck close to camp, busying myself with little tasks. I gathered more firewood, filtered water from the lake, and double-checked my gear. By the afternoon, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe even my own boot print, though deep down I knew it wasn't. Still, I decided to stay one more night. Leaving early felt like giving in to irrational fear. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping it would keep animals and anything else away. I stayed up late, staring into the flames, listening. The forest was alive with sounds, but nothing out of the ordinary. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I retreated to my tent. I woke up sometime in the early hours, heart pounding. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. Then I heard it, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Breathing, slow, deliberate, and close. It wasn't coming from inside the tent. but it was near, very near. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The breathing stopped, replaced by the faint crunch of footsteps moving away. When the sun rose, I packed up camp as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I scanned the area, looking for any signs of who or what had been there, but found nothing. The boot print from the previous day was still there, now joined by another, fainter one, leading away from my campsite. The hike back to my car was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me whipping around, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the trunk and locked the doors the moment I got inside. I sat there for a few minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down before starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the trail behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dense forest on either side. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on paved roads, that I started to feel safe again. I never did find out who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was just another camper, curious but harmless. Maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, it's not an experience I'll forget. I've gone camping since, but I've stuck to established sites, places where other people are around. The solitude that once drew me to the wilderness now feels like a risk I'm not willing to take. Some things I've learned are better left unknown. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys solitude, so when I decided to take a week off work and head out on a solo camping trip, it felt like the perfect way to recharge. I chose a spot deep in the Adirondack Mountains, far from any established campgrounds. The area was known for its dense forests, crystal clear lakes, and complete isolation. It was exactly what I needed. A break from the constant hum of city life and a chance to just exist without distractions. The first day went smoothly. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail wound through thick woods, the scent of pine filling the air. The crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional bird call were the only sounds around. After about 5 hours of hiking, I found a clearing near a small, serene lake. The spot was perfect. A flat area for my tent, access to fresh water, and no sign of anyone else for miles. I set up camp, gathered some firewood, and spent the evening cooking over the fire, staring up at the stars. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. The second day was more of the same. I spent the morning fishing, catching a few small trout that I cooked for lunch. In the afternoon, I explored the surrounding area, marking my way with small piles of rocks so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was beautiful but disorienting. Every direction looked the same after a while. I made it back to camp before dusk and settled in for another quiet night. It wasn't until the third day that I started to feel uneasy. It began as a subtle sensation, like I was being watched. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to nerves from being alone in the wilderness. But as the day went on, the feeling grew stronger. While gathering firewood, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees and silence. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a fox. But the thought lingered. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming before, now felt oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches casting long, spindly shadows in the firelight. Every crackle of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I told myself I was overreacting, that being alone was playing tricks on my mind. But even inside my tent, with the fire still burning outside, I couldn't relax. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, and I woke up several times, straining my ears for any sound beyond the crackling fire. On the fourth day, I decided to hike further out, thinking that maybe moving to a new spot would help ease my nerves. I packed up my gear and set off, heading deeper into the forest. The trail was faint, more of a suggestion than an actual path, but I had my map and compass to guide me. After several hours, I found another clearing, this one smaller but still suitable for camping. I set up my tent and tried to settle in, but the unease from the previous night followed me. While gathering wood for the evening fire, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A boot, half buried in the dirt. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, but it was unmistakably human. My first thought was that it belonged to a hiker who had passed through years ago, but as I looked closer, I noticed that the boot wasn't as weathered as it should have been if it had been out here for years. It looked like it had been there for maybe a few months at most. I looked around but didn't see anything else. No other gear, no sign of a campsite. Just the boot sitting there like some kind of warning. I returned to my camp with the wood but couldn't stop thinking about the boot. That night, I kept my fire burning brighter and longer than usual. The woods felt alive with sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant howl of some animal. But none of it sounded quite right. The noises were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like they were being made by something or someone trying to get my attention. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, my eyes darting to every shadow. At some point in the early hours of the morning, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A shape, just barely visible in the faint light of the dying fire. My heart pounded as I stared, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the shape didn't move like an animal. It was upright, humanoid. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the fifth day, I'd had enough. The solitude I'd once craved now felt like a trap. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. I packed up my camp in record time and started hiking, keeping a brisk pace. The forest felt different, the air heavier, the sounds sharper. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, matching my own. I'd stop and turn, scanning the trees, but there was never anyone there. About halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Another boot, identical to the one I'd seen the day before. This one was lying in the middle of the trail, as if someone had placed it there. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. Running would only make me an easier target if someone or something was out here. I kept moving, faster now, my senses on high alert. The trail, which had seemed so straightforward on the way in, now felt like a maze. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen one of my trail markers in a while. Panic set in as I searched for the next marker, but it was nowhere to be found. I must have wandered off the path without realizing it. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to find shelter. Wandering through the forest at night was not an option. I found a cluster of large rocks and decided to make camp there, hoping the natural barrier would provide some protection. I didn't bother with a fire. The light might attract whatever was out there. Instead, I huddled in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, every muscle in my body tense. The night was the longest of my life. The sounds in the forest grew louder, more deliberate. At one point, I heard what sounded like whispers, faint and just on the edge of hearing. My rational mind told me it was the wind, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The whispers seemed to come closer, circling my makeshift camp. I didn't move, barely even breathed, terrified of drawing attention to myself. When the first light of dawn broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up and started moving, using my compass to head west toward the trailhead. My pace was frantic, my mind racing. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves felt like a threat. I stumbled more than once, my exhaustion and fear taking their toll. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was still there, just as I'd left it. Relief flooded through me as I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever had been out there was still following me. I never reported what happened. What would I even say? That I found a couple of boots and felt uneasy? That I thought I saw a shape in the woods? It's been months since that trip, and I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again. I've always enjoyed camping. The simplicity of the woods, the quiet nights, the crackling fire is where I feel most at peace. A few months ago, I planned a solo camping trip deep in the national forest. I'd done it before, and I thought I knew what I was doing. I was wrong. I chose a spot far off the beaten path, one that required several hours of hiking to reach. The trailhead was barely marked, just a faded wooden sign pointing into the trees. I parked my car in the small dirt lot, shouldered my heavy pack, and started the trek. The first few hours were peaceful. The forest was alive with birdsong and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streaks. The deeper I went, the less distinct the trail became. Eventually, it faded altogether, and I had to rely on my map and compass. I'd done my research beforehand and knew roughly where I was heading. My plan was to set up camp by a small, secluded lake I'd read about. According to my map, it was surrounded by thick forest and rarely visited. Perfect for a quiet weekend away from everything. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was as beautiful as I'd hoped. A mirror-like surface reflecting the towering pines and the clear blue sky. I found a flat spot a little way back from the water and pitched my tent. After setting up camp, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire. Dinner was simple: a can of chili heated over the flames and a granola bar for dessert. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was why I loved camping. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up early, brewed a cup of coffee over the fire, and spent the day exploring the area. The forest was dense, with moss-covered logs and ferns carpeting the ground. I found a few animal tracks near the lake. Deer, maybe a raccoon, but nothing unusual. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, tired but happy. I cooked another simple meal and watched the sunset from a rock by the water. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird. That night, things started to feel different. I just crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, but the sound didn't stop. It circled my camp, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I lay completely still, straining to hear more. The footsteps paused, then started again, moving closer to my tent. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but the only thing I heard was the wind in the trees. By morning, I'd convinced myself it had been a deer or some other curious animal. I shook off the unease and went about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. While gathering more firewood, I noticed something odd. A few branches on the ground looked freshly broken, and there were strange scuff marks in the dirt. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd seen before. I tried to ignore it, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. That evening, I decided to keep the fire burning all night. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I ate quickly and sat by the fire, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. At first, everything seemed normal. But as the night deepened, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They circled my camp again, coming closer and closer. I called out, hoping it was another camper who'd wandered off the trail. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam illuminated nothing but endless trunks and shadows. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence was deafening. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. I decided I'd had enough and started packing up my gear. As I was dismantling my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, just a few feet from where I'd been sleeping, was a single bare footprint. It was human, but larger than my own foot, and I'm not a small guy. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp soil. Whoever or whatever had been out there last night had been close. Too close. I hurried to finish packing and started the hike back to my car. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The trail seemed longer than I remembered, and the forest felt darker, more oppressive. By the time I reached the parking lot, my legs were shaking. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my pack in the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the trailhead. For a split second, I thought I saw movement among the trees. A figure tall and shadowy, just at the edge of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stick around to find out if it was real. I drove away as fast as the narrow dirt road would allow, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened out there. I've told myself it was just another camper, maybe a hunter who didn't want to be seen. But deep down, I'm not so sure. Something about those footsteps, that footprint, felt wrong. I haven't been camping since. I've always found peace in the outdoors, so when the stress of work and life piled on, I decided a solo camping trip was just what I needed. I planned everything meticulously, the route, the gear, even the meals. The destination was a secluded spot in the Appalachian Mountains, far enough from any established campground to feel completely isolated. That's what I wanted, isolation. The drive to the trailhead took half a day, winding through small towns and stretches of forested roads. By the time I parked and shouldered my pack, it was late afternoon. The air was crisp, a perfect autumn day, with the sun casting long shadows through the trees. I locked the car, double-checked my map, and started hiking. The trail was well-worn but deserted, the kind of path that felt inviting but slightly unnerving when you're alone. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, leaves rustling, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I followed the trail for a few miles before veering off into the wilderness. I'd marked a clearing on my map, a spot near a stream where I planned to set up camp. It wasn't too far off the trail, but far enough that I wouldn't expect to see anyone else. When I reached the clearing, it was exactly as I'd hoped. The ground was flat and covered in soft pine needles, with enough open space to let sunlight filter through. The stream gurgled nearby, a soothing background noise. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. Dinner was a simple affair, instant noodles and a protein bar, but it tasted like a feast out there. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I pulled on an extra layer and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest around me was dark, the kind of darkness you only get far away from civilization. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd needed, or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard a faint noise outside. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the calls of nocturnal animals. This was different, deliberate. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, moving around the perimeter of my camp. I froze, every muscle tensing as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to shake off the unease and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my heart race. About 10 feet from my tent, the ground was disturbed. The pine needles were scattered, and there was a faint imprint of a boot. Not an animal, not a trick of the light, a human boot print. It wasn't mine. I'd been careful about where I stepped when setting up camp. Someone had been there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old print. Maybe another hiker had passed through recently. But deep down, I knew it didn't make sense. This spot was off the trail, and I hadn't seen anyone else since I started hiking. I decided to pack up and move to a different location. The forest was vast. There were plenty of other spots to camp. I hiked for most of the day, keeping a close eye on my surroundings. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put me on edge. I finally found another clearing, even more secluded than the first. It was near a rocky outcrop with a good view of the valley below. I set up camp again, telling myself I was overreacting. Whoever had been near my first camp was probably long gone. That night, I built a fire and sat close to it, feeling the warmth on my face. The stars above were brilliant, a reminder of why I loved being out here. But the unease lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling my camp. My heart pounded as I sat frozen by the fire, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the flames, but I could hear it. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. No response. The footsteps stopped. The forest was silent. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight and my camping knife. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and decided to cut the trip short. Whatever was going on, it wasn't worth staying another night. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me whip around, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack in the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the forest. But when I looked again, it was gone. I haven't been camping since. The outdoors used to feel like a refuge, a place to escape and find peace. Now, it feels like a place where you're utterly alone, and sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. I had been planning the trip for months. Camping alone was something I'd always wanted to do, a way to disconnect from the constant noise of daily life. The idea of solitude in the woods, just me and the wilderness, felt like the perfect escape. I chose a spot deep in the Adirondacks, far from any established campgrounds. It wasn't an official trail, but one I'd read about on a hiking forum. Secluded, challenging, and supposedly beautiful. Sounded ideal. The drive up was uneventful. The further I got from the city, the more the landscape shifted into rolling hills, dense forests, and winding roads. By the time I reached the dirt path that served as the trailhead, there was no cell service. That was fine by me, it was part of the appeal. I parked my car at a small clearing and double-checked my gear. I had everything: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a backpack full of supplies, and enough food and water for 3 days. I also carried a basic first aid kit, a map, and a compass just in case. The trail was barely marked, more of a suggestion than a path, winding its way through thick underbrush and towering trees. The first few hours were peaceful. The air was crisp. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. As I climbed higher, The trees thinned out, and I caught glimpses of the valley below. It was breathtaking. I felt a surge of pride knowing I'd made the effort to come here. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached the spot I'd chosen to set up camp, a small clearing near a babbling brook. The water was clear and cold, perfect for drinking and cooking. Setting up the tent was quick. I practiced at home, so I had it pitched and secured in no time. After arranging my sleeping gear and stashing my food in a bear-proof bag a good distance away, I sat by the brook to eat a late lunch. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. It was so quiet, so peaceful. I felt a sense of accomplishment and calm that I hadn't experienced in years. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore the area. I followed the brook upstream, climbing over rocks and fallen logs. The forest felt alive but indifferent to my presence. It was a comforting thought, being a small part of something vast and ancient. I found a spot where the brook widened into a shallow pool and spent some time there, soaking my feet and enjoying the stillness. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping low. The forest was bathed in golden light, shadows stretching long and thin. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth and cooking. Dinner was a simple affair, instant noodles and a granola bar. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with new sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant rustling of leaves. It was both eerie and beautiful. I stayed by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and letting my thoughts wander. Eventually, the chill in the air drove me into the tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, turned off my flashlight, and lay there listening to the night. Sleep came slowly, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me on edge. But eventually, I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow outside the tent. The forest was silent. Too silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, but there was only the thudding of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves. It was close, too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through the possibilities. A deer? A raccoon? Maybe even a bear? I reached for the small can of bear spray I'd kept by my sleeping bag. My fingers trembled as I gripped it. The sound came again, deliberate and slow, as if whatever it was didn't care about being heard. My throat was dry, my breathing shallow. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but something felt off. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the fabric of the tent rustled, as if something was brushing against it. I held my breath, clutching the bear spray so tightly my hand hurt. The rustling stopped, and there was a long silence. I waited, my muscles screaming from the tension. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like hours, too scared to even breathe loudly. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked outside. The clearing looked just as I'd left it, but the ground near the tent showed signs of disturbance. The grass was flattened, and there were faint impressions in the dirt. Human footprints. My stomach dropped. They weren't mine. They were too large and heading toward the tent. Whoever it was had been here right outside while I slept. I spent the morning packing up camp as quickly as I could. The sense of peace I'd felt the day before was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The hike back to the car was grueling. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming, now felt oppressive. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors before even starting the engine. The drive back to civilization was a blur. It wasn't until I was safely home, doors locked and curtains drawn, that I allowed myself to process what had happened. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but I've never gone camping alone again. Camping had always been my way of getting away from the noise of the world. There was something about being surrounded by nature that helped me reset. No phone calls, no emails, just the sound of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It had been a stressful few months at work, and I knew I needed a break. That's how I ended up planning a solo camping trip deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to clear my head and reconnect with the outdoors. But it turned out to be anything but relaxing. The drive to the campsite took about 6 hours. I had picked a spot that wasn't part of any established campground. It was one of those places you had to hike to after parking your car at the trailhead. I'd found it while poring over a topographic map, a tiny clearing near a small stream, about 5 miles from the nearest road. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. I'd packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, and a GPS device in case I got lost. My backpack weighed a ton, but I didn't mind. I was ready for some solitude. The hike to the clearing was uneventful, though it took longer than I expected. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and the steep inclines made me pause more often than I'd like to admit. Still, the scenery was beautiful. The forest was dense, with towering pines and a soft carpet of moss underfoot. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird and the crunch of my boots on the ground. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The clearing itself was perfect. It was flat and sheltered on 3 sides by tall trees, with the stream running along the edge. I quickly set up my tent and got a small fire going. Dinner was a simple meal of canned soup and some crackers, eaten while sitting on a log and watching the flames dance. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and I was grateful for the warmth of the fire. The stars came out, brighter than I'd ever seen them. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. Little did I know it wouldn't last. The first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, lulled by the sound of the stream and the cool, fresh air. The next morning, I decided to spend the day exploring the area. I didn't wander too far from the clearing, just in case I lost my bearings, but I managed to cover a fair bit of ground. The forest was stunning, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy and little wildflowers dotting the undergrowth. I even spotted a deer grazing in the distance. By the time I returned to the clearing, it was late afternoon, and my stomach was growling. I made another simple meal, sat by the fire, and watched the sunset. It was exactly the kind of quiet I'd been craving. Things started to feel off on the second night. I woke up sometime after midnight to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It wasn't the wind or the usual rustling of animals in the underbrush. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking against wood. I lay there in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the stream. I told myself it was probably just a branch caught in the current, bumping against a rock. But the sound didn't stop, continued steady and deliberate for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I tried to shake off the unease as I went about my day. Maybe I'd been imagining things, I thought, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to stay closer to the clearing that day, gathering firewood and double-checking my supplies. The tapping sound was still on my mind, but I didn't hear it again during the day. By the time night fell, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing. That night, the sound came back. This time, it was louder and closer, like it was right outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping wasn't random. It had a pattern, like someone knocking on a door. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the sound continued. My hand shook as I aimed the flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a woodpecker or some other animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the fourth day, I decided to cut my trip short. The peaceful solitude I'd been seeking had turned into something else entirely. I packed up my gear and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just days ago, now felt oppressive. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About halfway back to the car, I found something that made my blood run cold. A tree near the trail had deep, fresh gouges in the bark, like claw marks. They were too high up to have been made by any animal I could think of. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but nothing fit. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The sense of being watched was stronger than ever. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I threw my gear into the car and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing there. When I got home, I tried to put the experience behind me. I told myself it was all in my head, that I'd let my imagination get the better of me. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that tapping sound and those claw marks on the tree. I've been camping many times since, but I've never gone back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. Camping in the woods had always been my go-to escape. When life in the city got too loud, too suffocating, I packed up my gear and headed out to where the air was clean and the stars were brighter. This time, I chose a remote national forest, a place known for its rugged trails and serene lakes. I'd never been there before, and the idea of exploring unfamiliar territory excited me. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck with a camper shell. I figured someone had come out for a long stay just like me. The weather was perfect, crisp air, a slight breeze, and the promise of a clear sky. After double-checking my pack to make sure I had everything, I hoisted it onto my back and started up the trail. The first day was uneventful but beautiful. The trail wound through dense pine forests, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of rolling hills and distant peaks. I took my time, stopping frequently to snap photos and take in the scenery. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The sounds of the forest at night were comforting. The chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt completely at peace, miles away from the stress of my everyday life. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the soothing sound of the stream. The next morning, I decided to explore deeper into the forest. I packed a day's worth of supplies and left my tent and other gear behind. The trail became less defined as I ventured further, and I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. Around midday, I stumbled upon a small, hidden lake. The water was so clear I could see fish swimming near the bottom. I spent a couple of hours there, eating lunch and enjoying the solitude. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I decided to head back to my campsite. That's when things started to feel off. The forest, which had felt so inviting earlier, now seemed darker, denser. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the usual sounds of wildlife grew eerily quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination, a natural reaction to being alone in an unfamiliar place. But then I realized I was lost. I checked my map and compass, but nothing seemed to make sense. Every direction looked the same, and I couldn't find any landmarks I recognized. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that as long as I had my bearings, I could find my way back. I decided to follow the stream, reasoning that it would eventually lead me to my campsite. The going was slow, the terrain was uneven, and the underbrush was thick. As the sun set, I realized I wouldn't make it back before dark. I had no choice but to find a place to spend the night. I found a relatively flat spot near the stream and set up a makeshift camp. Without my tent, I had to rely on my emergency blanket for warmth. I built a small fire and sat close to it, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep much, if at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a faint rustling, the snap of a twig, and my eyes would snap open again. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. I resumed my journey along the stream, hoping it would lead me back to familiar ground. After a few hours, I came across a set of footprints in the mud. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone out here. Maybe the footprints belonged to whoever owned the pickup truck I'd seen at the trailhead. I decided to follow them. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, away from the stream. They were fresh, and I was confident I'd catch up to whoever made them. But as I followed them, a nagging feeling of unease grew stronger. The tracks didn't follow a clear path. They zigzagged and doubled back on themselves, as if the person had been wandering aimlessly. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A torn piece of fabric hung from a low branch. It looked like it had been ripped from a shirt or jacket. There were dark stains on it, stains that looked an awful lot like dried blood. My first thought was that someone was injured and needed help. But as I stood there, staring at the scrap of fabric, another possibility crept into my mind. What if whoever left these tracks wasn't lost or injured? What if they were running from something? I debated whether to keep following the tracks. Part of me wanted to turn back, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had happened here. But another part of me, the part that didn't want to spend another night lost in the woods, decided to press on. I needed to find help, and these tracks were my best chance. The further I went, the more unnerving things became. I started noticing other signs: broken branches, scuffed bark, and more scraps of fabric. The forest seemed to grow darker and quieter with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin stood in a clearing up ahead. The roof sagged, and the windows were dark and empty. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney, suggesting someone was inside. My first instinct was to approach cautiously. Whoever lived there might be able to help me, but they might also be the source of the strange occurrences I'd encountered. I circled the cabin, staying just within the tree line. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the smoke from the chimney meant someone had to be there recently. I weighed my options. Should I call out, knock on the door, or should I turn around and keep moving? Before I could decide, a sound from inside the cabin froze me in place. It was faint but unmistakable, the creak of floorboards, as if someone was moving around. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched lower, trying to stay hidden. Then, without warning, The door slammed shut. I didn't wait to see who or what had closed it. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I tore through the forest. I stumbled over roots and rocks but didn't stop until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally stopped, I realized I was back near the stream. Somehow, in my blind panic, I'd managed to find my way back to familiar ground. Relief mingled with fear as I tried to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't stay there long. Whoever or whatever was in that cabin might have seen me. I needed to keep moving. I followed the stream until I reached a spot that looked familiar. It was the clearing where I'd camped on my first night. My tent was still there, untouched. I quickly gathered my gear, packed up, and started back toward the trailhead. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to eat. My only goal was to get out of the forest as fast as possible. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was setting. My car was the only vehicle there. The old pickup truck was gone. I threw my pack into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind me, dark and silent. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main highway. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know what I encountered out there. If it was a person, an animal, or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But one thing is certain. I won't be going back to that forest anytime soon.